I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 6. Decisions. January 25th, 2021, Washington, D.C., White House. President Jonathan Sachs lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. This was only his third night back in the White House. It felt good to be back in his own bed, but he had to admit he missed being cooped up with General Peterson and his other two compatriots from the tunnel. Having never served in the military, he had previously not comprehended what soldiers meant when they talked about the bond of combat. Now he really understood why those connections were so tight. Sachs looked at his alarm clock. Damn, only 18 minutes since the last time I checked. Shaking his head in frustration, the president flipped the covers off his body and swung his feet over the side of the bed. He figured at this point he might as well get dressed. In a moment, he'd already put on a polo shirt and pair of khaki pants. Sachs looked back at the bed. His wife was still asleep, her breathing quiet. She'd told him that her sleep had been much more peaceful since he'd returned home. He glanced at the alarm clock one last time. It was 4:26 a.m. He let out a sigh and headed down to the Oval to get a jump on the day. As he exited the residence, his Secret Service detail quickly fell in line as he moved down the hallway. The Department of Homeland Security wasn't messing around with the president's safety. Not that they had before, but now that he'd been rescued, they'd really beefed up the protective measures. The Marine Guards, who usually wore their dress uniforms, were now tricked out in full body armor and carried their combat rifles. There was no more pretending all was normal and well at the White House. When the president left for a public event, his head of security made damn sure he was guarded by a phalanx of heavily armed Marines, in addition to ordering his Secret Service agents to openly carry assault rifles and wear body armor. He'd nearly been killed once. The Secret Service wasn't about to allow it to happen again. Once he walked into the Oval Office, the president made his way around the desk and took a seat at his chair. He reached for the inbox on the left side of his desk and immediately read through the materials and reports that required his signature. Sachs pored over some of them in detail, while he'd skimmed through others. He signed off on several documents, then put a bunch of other papers in a pile. Those he either marked with red strikes through specific sections or left comments for the author to amend or clarify before he'd sign off. In a way, it felt good just to bury his head in work, to keep his mind busy, and it kept him from flashing back to being trapped in the tunnel. For a while, he'd really believed he was going to die down there. It had scared him to think that his life was going to end, that he wouldn't be able to see his kids or his wife again. That feeling made the entire situation he now found himself in feel all the worse. The country was being invaded and in the process of completely unraveling itself. Thousands upon thousands of people were being killed across the country, and he felt powerless to stop it. He ached for the families who were losing loved ones, especially those who were losing family members from the seemingly senseless political violence and retribution that were starting to spread. Yesterday, he'd heard a report from the FBI that had said more than 800 people had been killed in politically motivated attacks. The president went down a rabbit trail of thought, trying to figure out how to stop America from becoming like the Balkans. An hour into the president's work, his chief of staff, Rich Novella, walked in. "Good morning, sir. Couldn't sleep?" Rich inquired with a bit of concern in his voice. Sachs looked up. "No, I figured I might as well do some work," he answered nonchalantly. "But hey, since you're here, what the hell is going on with Japan? How can they possibly expect us to be able to evacuate all our equipment and personnel from the country in 2 weeks? Hell, the West Coast is causing all kinds of problems right now, so it's not like we can just relocate most of these forces and equipment there." Rich sighed frustratedly. "They don't want to be invaded, Mr. President. The Japanese don't exactly have a large combat-ready military. They can't stand up to the Chinese, and with us spread so thin, they know they won't get any reinforcements from us. So rather than try and fight it out in a war they know they'd lose, they're going to try and sit this one out." "Yeah, but can we reasonably get our stuff out of there in time?" Rich shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know. That'd be a better question to ask during the military briefing later this morning." The president shook his head. "What's the situation like down in Cuba and Puerto Rico?" Rich plopped down in the chair next to the president's desk and shot Sachs an enigmatic look. "The Marines really kicked ass, sir. The Cuban army landed one hell of a sneak attack on Gitmo, but that lasted for maybe 20 minutes. Once the Marines got themselves organized and retaliated, they managed to capture or liberate the entire eastern half of the country, all the way up to Las Tunas. Hell, if you gave them the order to march on Havana, I think we could probably capture it within a week." Sachs' jaw dropped slightly in disbelief. How is it the Cuban military is so thoroughly fallen apart like this? I mean, we don't have a ton of Marines down there. How was that small force able to tear them apart so quickly? Rich shrugged his shoulders. "I don't think the Cuban army is as strong or determined to die for their country as our Marines are. If you want more specifics, I think you'll have to ask the Joint Chiefs. I've told you about as much as I know." Standing up, Rich walked over to the pot of fresh coffee that one of the stewards had brought in and proceeded to pour himself a cup. When he'd finished adding a dash of milk and a teaspoon of sugar, he carried his mug back to the chair next to the president's desk and resumed his conversation. Sighing, he said, "Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic are a different story, sir." "How so? My understanding is that the Navy intercepted the Russians' little convoy of ships on their way back from Venezuela." Rich took a sip of his coffee and nodded. "They did. But we've still got a brigade of Russian naval infantry on both islands to deal with. They've effectively taken control of Puerto Rico and the DR for the time being. They haven't crossed over into Haiti yet, but I don't think that was their mission." The president took a sip of his own coffee, then changed the subject. "So how are things across the rest of the country? I mean, what's the mood like?" He was still trying to get up to speed after being out of the loop for several days. Rich shifted in his chair. "It's tough right now, Mr. President. The West Coast is in open insurrection, and a good chunk of the Northeast is still under UN control. Fighting's been pretty tough in the Midwest, too. On top of that, people are concerned that we're about to be invaded by the Chinese in the Southwest." Sachs snorted. "I think the VP's little plan to nuke the Three Gorges Dam seems to have given them some pause." "It has, but I don't think it's going to stop them," Rich replied glumly. "They haven't slowed down their deployment of troops into Mexico. If anything, it's given them time to beef up the protection of the dam." The president sighed. "One problem at a time, Rich." He ran his fingers through his hair. "Back to California and the rest of the West Coast. What are your thoughts on how to put down this rebellion and bring them back into the fold?" His longtime chief of staff shook his head. "You aren't going to like my suggestions." Sachs grunted at the honesty. "Why don't you try me? Being trapped in a tunnel for 6 days has given me a new perspective on life." Rich smirked at the president's answer. "We dissolve the state governments," he proposed. "If they won't comply with federal law and want to continue to pursue this path of recognizing that traitor Tate as president, then we dissolve their government and arrest them. Anyone that we catch in the act of taking up arms against the federal government, we execute, and we detain anyone who openly supports Tate." Rich paused for a moment, apparently trying to gauge the president's facial reactions before he continued. "Look, we have to stamp this insurrection out quickly, Mr. President. If we don't get the parts of the country we still control back under our authority, then the situation is only going to get worse and spread." The president swiveled his chair away to look out the window of his office. He kicked his feet out a bit as his body stretched out in the chair. Lincoln had arrested and detained folks during the First Civil War. Do the ends justify the means? He asked himself. 4 hours later, Washington, D.C., White House, Situation Room. The president looked at Patty Hogan. "What are our options in California and the other states that aren't responding to our inquiries?" he asked. Leaning forward in her chair, she said, "I think we should use the newly expanded Federal Protective Service we've been training up. They aren't military, and it'll still keep things within the law enforcement community." General Vance Pruitt grunted at the idea. "I don't think that force is going to be up to the task. Plus, I don't think their first batch of recruits has finished training yet, if I'm not mistaken." Lifting her chin up in indignation, Patty responded, "It's true that the first batch hasn't finished their training yet, but when they do, this would be a good test for them. Besides, we're going to stir up a negative publicity storm when you dissolve the state governments and move to arrest the legislators who are leading the rebellion. It'd be best to have these arrests made by federal law enforcement officials and not soldiers." "She's right," asserted FBI Director Polanski. "You don't want the military to be the ones making the arrests. I'd recommend my agents go in, and we should use Patty's folks for security and backup if needed." Sachs stroked his chin. In his opinion, the FBI was one of the few government agencies that were still somewhat respected and trusted by the public on both sides of the aisle. If he was going to follow through on arresting a few hundred legislators in these rebellious states, it'd be best to let the FBI be the public face of it. Turning to face Patty, the president said, "When will your first batch of trainees be ready?" She glanced down at her notepad. "February 1st, she responded. "Between the 6 training camps we've established with FLETC and U.S. Special Forces, we're going to start graduating 6,000 trainees a week at that point. My goal is to get 1,000 of them relocated into the capitals of the 18 states that are in open rebellion to assist the FBI in restoring order. We'll start with the states that are geographically closest to the ones still adhering to our authority, and look to expand outwards as we get more folks trained up. It's going to take some time, Mr. President, but it is a better approach for us to use the Federal Protective Service to handle the civil unrest than to place troops in the streets. Coupled with the FBI, I think this will give us much more public support and appear less like a hostile military takeover." Sachs nodded. "I agree, Patty. That was a good call you made when all of this started falling apart, keeping this in law enforcement lanes as opposed to using soldiers." The president then turned to his FBI director. "Polanski, your agents will make the arrests. Coordinate with Patty on when and how you guys will execute the warrants. Start drawing up the papers right now, and let's get things ready. I want this to happen rapidly when it gets moving. Make sure to make as many of those arrests as possible on the same day. Once word gets out about what's happening, you can bet a lot of the conspirators are going to go to ground." Director Polanski smiled and shot Patty a mischievous look. He seemed like he was going to enjoy this mission. Sachs stood up. "All right, that concludes the domestic affairs portion of this meeting. It's time to clear the room for the rest of the national security team." he announced. A couple of the military folks who were in the room remained, while other staffers and military personnel filed in. General Adrian Marcus, who'd taken over for General Austin Peterson as the newly appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs, took a seat next to the president. Sachs couldn't help but feel a twinge of sorrow. Unfortunately, General Peterson's leg had become severely infected during their 6-day ordeal in the tunnel. The doctors had ended up having to amputate his leg, and now he was struggling to fight off a series of infections that had spread to other parts of his body. Sachs had assured Peterson that there would always be a place for him as a senior advisor in the White House when he got better. But for the time being, he'd been forced to appoint a replacement. Ideally, Sachs would have selected General Tibbets from Northcom, but he had proven to be an incredibly effective overall military commander for U.S. forces, and it was determined that he could better serve the country by staying in command of the defense of North America than being cooped up with the president. After a few moments, General Marcus surveyed the room and then cleared his throat. "Mr. President, I'm going to go over the bottom line up front for each sector of the war. We'll stop and address any specific questions you may have as we go along. Otherwise, we'll move through the information at a pretty rapid clip." The president nodded, and the general continued. "In the North Atlantic, we sank 2 Russian submarines and 2 additional UN warships as they attempted to break through the blockade. We lost another destroyer, and one of our guided missile cruisers took a couple of hits. It looks like they'll be able to limp back to port for repairs, which is a good thing. That said, the blockade continues to stay in effect." When Sachs didn't have any direct questions, General Marcus continued to the next theater. "In the Pacific, we sank 5 Chinese warships and 8 submarines in the South China Sea and along the Chinese coast just south of Taiwan. We lost 2 destroyers and 2 submarines, 1 Virginia-class and 1 Los Angeles-class attack sub. Of particular concern were 2 submarines we sank off the coast of Alaska. Apparently, a Russian Oscar had tried to get in close to Anchorage, probably to try and put their land attack cruise missiles within range of Elmendorf Air Force Base and our anti-ballistic missile interceptor base at Fort Greely. The other Russian sub, an older Kilo class, tried to ambush one of our boomers as it made its way under the polar ice caps. Both Russian subs were sunk with no losses to our own forces." Pausing for a moment, General Marcus traded a nervous glance with Admiral Chester Smith, the Chief of Naval Operations, before he proceeded. "We have some concerns about Hawaii, Mr. President." Sachs surveyed Smith and Marcus's faces. "What specifically are you concerned with?" he asked. Admiral Smith interjected. "We've received some signals intelligence that indicates that the Chinese are planning some sort of major attack in the near future. We're not sure what specific kind of attack, but suffice it to say, they're planning on hitting our forward bases in the Pacific in advance of any ground combat along the southern border." The president furrowed his brow. "So based on your most educated guess, what kind of attack are you thinking? What bases are most at risk?" "They've already made good use of merchant raiders," Admiral Smith asserted. "My money says they're going to try and hit us with some sort of missile swarm attack. As to what bases are most at risk, I'd have to say Guam and Hawaii. While our bases in Japan would have been a threat, the Chinese were able to strong-arm the government into kicking us out of the country. The withdrawal has been kind of a mess. We've dispatched as many ships and planes as we can, but there's a lot of equipment that's going to end up being left behind." "What about getting some help from the Japanese?" Admiral Smith nodded. "And we're working on that. As a matter of fact, the Japanese have offered to let us use several dozen of their large roll-on, roll-off ships to help get our vehicles, tanks, and other armored equipment out. For the moment, they're going to move the equipment to Hawaii, unload it, and then make one more trip before the 2-week deadline ends. Once everything makes it to Hawaii, we'll work on getting it moved over to California. On the plus side, sir, we'll have the entire 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force relocating back to California. That will beef up our southern border defense and give us the additional resources we'll need to put down these uprisings in California once DHS is ready to make a move. Sachs paused for a moment, contemplating the situation. Okay, then here is what I want to have happen, he finally announced. When those additional Marines get to San Diego, I want you to start having them put down this rebellion in Los Angeles. We need to get that city under control again, and we need those ports. Yes, Mr. President, Admiral Smith responded. The President still had one burning question. If we know Guam and Hawaii are the most likely targets the Chinese are going to attack, then how do we want to defend them? He asked. General Marcus jumped back into the conversation. With your permission, we'd like to deploy additional THAADs to both Guam and Hawaii. I'd also recommend that we position our 2 carrier strike groups on opposite sides of Hawaii, one to guard the North Pacific and the other on standby to support Guam should the Chinese make a concerted move on it. The President nodded, giving them the go-ahead to redeploy the necessary forces. Before they could continue, Sachs asked, "What's going on with Taiwan? If the Chinese really are gearing up to attack us head-on, then Taiwan has to know they're in the crosshairs." "The Taiwanese are gearing up to repel any invasion attempts by the mainland," explained Admiral Smith. "I'm not confident they'll be successful, but they will definitely bloody the Chinese up pretty good. Unfortunately, there isn't much more we can do to help them." The President shook his head in disgust. All the Navy had been able to do so far was sink a few Chinese warships in the area. "I hate to say it, but for the time being they are on their own. Until we can defeat this UN force in the north and figure out what's going on with the Chinese in the south, we're tapped out. In the meantime, let's continue with the brief. I want to know what's going on along our northern border." General Marcus nodded and continued. "The 4th Infantry Division has officially secured Regina and Winnipeg, effectively cutting Canada in half. We've isolated the eastern half of Canada from their oil and natural gas pipelines in their western provinces. That's going to have a huge impact on their ability to function as a country and a military." "What about the Pacific Northwest? How's the offensive going there?" General Marcus replied. "It's actually going better than we thought, at least from a military perspective. We dropped an airborne brigade behind the UN lines, effectively cutting them off from any possible retreat out of the state. Lieutenant General Biggs, the commander for I Corps, was able to effectively drive the remaining Canadian, Russian, and Chinese forces back to the banks of the Snohomish River, where they ran into our airborne brigade. The clash lasted more or less for 3 days. They saw some really heavy fighting on the first day, but on the last day of the battle, the local UN commander surrendered his force. There's also a bit of a partisan fight that's brewing up there. On the positive side, a pro-American militia unit has grown pretty strong around the city of Burlington, not too far from the Canadian border. We don't know a lot about them yet, but what little we do know is they appear to have some of the National Guard deserters who wouldn't side with the governor. The group also appears to have linked up with some other militia groups to create a much larger force. General Pruitt, the Army Chief of Staff, broke into the conversation. "What's making this group so deadly against both the CDF and the UN force is that they appear to have a gifted bomb maker in their midst. My best guess is one or more of the National Guardsmen that deserted, or someone in the militia unit, is a former explosive ordnance disposal guy with combat experience in Iraq. Whoever is making those IEDs knows what the hell he's doing. He's been wreaking havoc on them since the war started." General Marcus nodded. "The bigger issue we're going to have to deal with, now that the UN force has largely been defeated, is the remnant of the CDF militia force. We estimate the number of those who haven't surrendered to be between 2,000 and 4,000. They're primarily clustered in a handful of densely populated enclaves, which means our soldiers are going to have to root them out in some of the cities. We're holding off on starting that part of the operation until we've fully dealt with the UN forces that surrendered. When I spoke with General Biggs earlier this morning, he told me that as of right now, they have collected 18,000 UN prisoners. He's having a hard time trying to figure out where to put them and how to logistically feed and guard them all while still carrying out his combat operations. The president let out a soft whistle. What were the UN casualties? I mean, if we took 18,000 prisoners, how many of them did we end up killing or wounding? General Marcus paused for a moment as he looked through his notes. The last report I got from the I Corps staff was roughly somewhere around 16,000 killed or wounded during the last 2 weeks of fighting. We're not sure what the CDF casualties are just yet, but they told me they estimated them to be somewhere around 10 or 11,000. Shaking his head in disgust, Sachs commented, "So much killing. I wish it hadn't come down to this." He paused for a moment to collect his thoughts before he asked, "What were our casualties?" Grimacing at the question, Marcus replied, 3,800. Most of that occurred during the 3-day battle. The airborne brigade we dropped in from Alaska bore a lot of those casualties. The UN force made a concerted effort to try and breach their lines to attempt a retreat to Canada. The paratroopers held the line, but took a beating doing so. Leaning forward, Sachs replied, "Send my regards and congratulations to the brigade commander. Make sure he knows the president said thank you for holding the line and winning this battle for us. While you're at it, award their brigade a presidential unit citation and give those paratroopers some valor medals. I can only imagine what kind of hell it must have been like for them to try and hold off a force of probably more than 20,000 soldiers with less than 2,000 men." General Marcus nodded. He turned to one of his aides. "Make sure you write that down to action it after the meeting," he ordered. Returning to his briefing, General Marcus pulled up a map of the Midwest and pointed to several units. 3rd Corps has established a line of defense spanning from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, down to Springfield, Illinois, then across to Bloomington, Indiana, through Cincinnati, Ohio, and on up to Cleveland. It's a massive bulge, but Lieutenant General Hightower believes he can hold the line while the rest of his corps continues to take up positions for his coming offensive. Sachs held up a hand. "When is his offensive supposed to start?" he asked. "In 6 days. "Why the delay?" the president asked, pushing back. "If he's formed up a defensive line and stopped the enemy, then why is he not pushing back on them?" His voice betrayed how irritated he felt with the slow response of the military to recapture lands lost while he had been trapped in the tunnel. General Tibbets from Northcom interjected. "That's my call, Mr. President. I ordered him to hold his position until we're ready to launch our counteroffensive. I'm still getting more of his units moved into place. Right now, we've been fighting it out with a joint Russian, Canadian, and French unit around Cleveland, Ohio, and Erie, Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, the 82nd Airborne has been fighting hard in the Allegheny Forest in Pennsylvania for the last 3 days. We lost New York State, and the UN forces are threatening to push down into New Jersey and potentially threaten Washington. Our focus right now has been on stopping them from doing that. Once that has been achieved, I'll allow General Hightower to launch his offensive. Until then, we can't split our forces that sparsely." The president nodded and uncrossed his arms. He motioned for General Marcus to continue with the brief. This was his first time getting a full update since he'd fully resumed his duties as president, so he was still drinking from a fire hose of information. "I'm going to bring us up to speed on the Caribbean before we move to the Southwest," General Marcus said, bringing up a new map. The Russians landed a brigade of naval infantry on Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. Our Navy interdicted their troop transport ships while they were attempting to ferry over more soldiers from Venezuela and sank them. For the time being, the Russians are going to be stuck on the island. They have the equipment they landed with, but not much else. And fortunately, it doesn't appear that the Russians landed with all the equipment that they'd hoped to bring. The NSA intercepted a communique between them and their headquarters. The second landing was supposed to drop off several S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile platforms. We're lucky the Navy was able to intercept them before they got those systems operational on the islands. It would have complicated things for us in the area considerably. The slides on the PowerPoint now shifted to show Cuba. The Marines have pushed the Cuban army back to Las Tunas. We effectively control the entire eastern half of the country. The 24th and 26th MEUs have fully offloaded their brigades at Gitmo. We've now got a combat force of 4,600 Marines in Cuba. Do you want us to continue to expand out further and try to drive on Havana, or what would you like us to do, Mr. President? Leaning forward in his chair, the President fixed a steely gaze on General Marcus. Can we support them moving on Havana? He asked. General Tibbets responded, Mr. President, the Cubans aren't in good shape right now. The bigger challenge we have, if we expand out further on the island, is the Russians. They have several fortified positions in and around Havana. That's what we need to take out. They've set up several SAM sites that are causing us some problems. The Navy's done a decent job of going after them, but we need ground pounders to go in there and make sure they're destroyed. My recommendation is we have the Marines hold their current position until we can send the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit from Camp Lejeune to reinforce them. Then I'll feel confident about pushing on Havana. Okay. Then have them hold their positions for the time being until you can get that other brigade moved over to support them. In the meantime, what are we doing with this growing force on our southern border? The President asked. The generals shared a nervous glance before they returned the President's eye contact. General Tibbets dared to speak first. Mr. President, we have a couple of ideas we'd like to get your permission to proceed with. January 30th, 2021, Northwestern Pennsylvania, Allegheny National Forest. Private First Class Johnson of the 2nd Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment shifted cautiously from one covered position to another. Each time he moved, he hoped that he wasn't about to be drilled by an unseen bullet. As his body thudded against a fallen log, he looked over the top of it into the distance, where his sergeant had said he'd spotted movement. Johnson squinted his eyes to try and see better, but he couldn't see it. As his eyes darted to the right and left, what he did spot was fresh snow starting to fall. There were already at least 4 inches on the ground, and it appeared like Mother Nature was going to give them some more. Slumping against the fallen log, Johnson couldn't help but admire the beauty of the forest as snow started to fall. If the area wasn't crawling with enemy soldiers trying to kill him and his comrades, it might have been a lovely day for a walk in the woods. "Contact, right!" shouted one of the soldiers in his squad. Then his fellow soldier fired his rifle several times at whatever he'd just seen. A second later, the entire forested area in front of them erupted in gunfire. Johnson ducked down below the fallen log, just in time to hear a string of rounds slap into the wood, chipping away at his newfound protective barrier. "Covering fire!" shouted another private. Johnson jumped up from behind the log and proceeded to fire off 4 3-round bursts at a cluster of trees and underbrush where he saw a handful of enemy soldiers. "Grenade!" someone yelled. "Boom! Take that machine gun position out!" shouted his sergeant. "Oh, hell, I'm hit!" screamed one of Johnson's friends, Tippins. "Medic! Oh, God! Medic!" "Covering fire! Hang in there, Tippins. I'm on my way," their medic bellowed. Johnson couldn't see what was wrong with his friend, but he could hear him continue to scream and thrash about. Pop, swoosh, boom! 203! Johnson watched as the entire tree line, maybe 200 meters in front of him, erupted in explosions and fire. One of his squad mates had fired off a couple of M203 grenades at the enemy position, while another soldier hit the enemy gun position with one of their AT-4 rockets. Dropping his now empty magazine, Johnson slapped a fresh one in its place. He hit the bolt release, ramming a fresh round into the chamber. Johnson rolled over onto his belly and proceeded to crawl over to another firing position, maybe 5 meters away. He then rescanned his sector, looking for a target to shoot. Meanwhile, the guys in his squad continued to scream out orders and information to each other as they engaged the enemy soldiers. Just as Johnson got to his new firing position, he heard the unmistakable sound of incoming artillery. Oh crap, that's not friendly, he realized. Boom, boom, boom! 3 artillery rounds hit roughly 300 or 400 meters behind their position. "Everyone, move forward!" yelled their lieutenant frantically. "We need to get closer to the enemy so they don't start dropping arty rounds on us." Private Johnson shook his head in frustration. The LT had just gotten the rest of the platoon moved over to assist them, and they were finally starting to tear into the enemy positions with the added firepower. But he knew the man was right. Johnson searched for the next best position to run to and spotted another fallen log, maybe 20 meters in front of him. Looking to his right, he saw 2 of his squad mates. He waved his hand and pointed to the position. They both nodded. "Cover me!" he shouted. Then he jumped up from his position and charged forward. As he sprinted full out, bullets zipped past him like angry bees. Dirt and snow kicked up all around his feet. He dove for the fallen log, landing hard on the ground just as a grenade exploded maybe 10 meters in front of him. Johnson found himself being showered by a cascade of debris mixed with slush. When the cloud had dissipated enough so that he could see again, he rose up on his right knee and brought his rifle to bear. Ahead of him were a handful of enemy soldiers who were shifting their fire in his direction. Johnson quickly unleashed several 3-round bursts from his M4 to provide covering fire for his other squad mates, who were now racing forward to join him. In seconds, one of the enemy soldiers' heads had burst into a cloud of red spray, and another clutched at his chest and fell backward. Sensing he should duck, Johnson dropped to his belly and rolled on his back and to his left. A string of bullets hit right where he had just been. Then an explosion rocked the log he had been hiding behind, and the portion of the tree exploded. Johnson winced as he felt a couple of sharp objects bite into his left leg. Looking down past his feet, he saw 2 of his fellow soldiers charging toward him. His sergeant was running with his rifle against his shoulder, firing away at the enemy while he advanced. The other man, his friend, Private Miller, had a look of sheer terror on his face as he ran like hell for his position. Suddenly, Miller's facial expression changed from terror to one of intense pain as an explosion went off near him and his right leg was ripped off. The man tumbled several times as he fell to the ground. The sergeant continued to run toward Johnson, finally landing right next to him. "Chuck a couple of grenades at those bastards and then go back and grab Miller," barked the sergeant. He coughed briefly and did his best to get his breathing under control. Johnson pulled 2 of the grenades from his IBA and placed them on the ground in front of him. He pulled the pin on one and threw it for all it's worth in the direction of the enemy. He then repeated the process with the second grenade. "I'm hit, Johnson! God, it hurts, man! Someone help me! Don't leave me here!" His wounded friend continued to cry out. "I'll cover you. Go grab him," his sergeant barked. Then he laid into the enemy position with his new M27 infantry automatic rifle. That beast could lay down some serious suppressive fire. Crawling back to his feet, Johnson took off the 10 meters to his friend, whose leg was still bleeding profusely. Reaching down, he grabbed the handle on the top of the back of Miller's IBA and dragged him as fast as he could to their position. When Johnson reached the fallen log, he knelt down next to Miller, grabbed his tourniquet from the field dressing pouch, and got it set up on his right leg. Once he had it in place, He cranked it tight, causing his friend to scream wildly from the excruciating pain. Their sergeant barked, "Hold that scream in! Take the pain, Miller! Your screaming is going to attract more attention to us and get us all killed!" Wrinkling his face in anger, Miller did his best to stifle another scream as Johnson finished tightening the tourniquet. Looking down at his wounded friend, Johnson said, "I've got it tied off. The bleeding looks to have stopped. But you have to try and not move much, okay? We'll get you some more help once we finish killing these guys." With that, Johnson returned his attention to the attackers in front of them, hurling another grenade toward the enemy. Then several loud shrieks that sounded like runaway freight trains headed right for them. "Everyone down!" screamed their sergeant. Johnson dropped below the lip of the fallen log again. The world around them disintegrated into utter chaos as artillery round after artillery round landed among the trees where they were hunkering down. Chunks of hot shrapnel and splintered wood flew in every direction. Some of the rounds exploded as airbursts, delivering a rain shower of scorching red metal from the sky. The barrage lasted maybe 10 seconds. When the noise of the explosions died down, the overwhelming sound was screams of agony. Private Johnson turned to check on Miller. A huge chunk of wood had buried itself in his friend's neck, nearly severing it from the rest of his body. Miller was dead. His eyes were already glazed over. "Forget him," said his sergeant callously. "Focus on killing the enemy in front of us. We need to take him out or we're dead." Then, following his own advice, he let loose a full magazine's worth of bullets at the UN soldiers. The urge for survival forced Johnson to do his best to shake off the scene of his dead friend. He scanned the forest in front of him. One of the sergeant's rounds caused an enemy soldier to grab at his neck. Another dropped like a sack of potatoes. However, a third soldier brought some sort of light machine gun to bear and cut loose a long string of bullets in their direction. Johnson ducked. He heard a grunt and a wet, fleshy sound. As he glanced over at his sergeant, Johnson watched him fall backward, hit by multiple bullets. His sergeant was dead before he hit the ground. "Damn, I'm all alone now," Johnson thought. He turned and looked around behind him. All he saw was either dead bodies of his squad and platoon mates or men crying out for help. There didn't seem to be anyone left unhurt to help him or continue the fight. Johnson turned back to his sergeant, reached over for the M27, and readied himself to use it. Abruptly, the battlefield became quiet. No one was shooting anymore. All Johnson could hear was the cries for the medics. As he lay on his back, trying to decide if he should jump back up and resume shooting or not, he heard voices. "Check your sectors in advance," called out a voice in English. "We got a lot of wounded over here. What do you want us to do with them?" asked another. Could those be Americans? Johnson wondered. "If they're wounded, help them out. If they give you any trouble, kill them," replied another. Just as Johnson was about to crawl over and engage whoever was moving toward him, he heard a couple of branches snap. "Don't even try it, or I'll light you up," shouted a loud, commanding voice near him. Moving his hands away from his rifle, Johnson held them out and turned to see two soldiers pointing their weapons at him. "Who the hell are you guys?" Johnson asked. They were clearly speaking English, which confused him. Smiling, the soldier replied, 48th Highlanders. We're Canadian." He paused for a second as he lowered his rifle. His comrade did the same before he added, "You damn Yanks cost us a lot of good men." Sitting up slowly so as to not get shot, Johnson replied, "Yeah, you Canucks cost us a few as well." With nothing more to say, they gestured for him to get up. Then they trudged him back toward their lines into an uncertain future. Chapter 7. Detention Camps. January 31st, 2021, Fort Stewart, Georgia. Rows and rows of white tents had been set up for as far as the eye could see. Every couple hundred meters, there was a cluster of 10 portable toilets positioned between them. Near each group of portable toilets were 2 prefabricated shower trailers. The site had turned into a truly massive camp, only a couple of miles outside the town of Hinesville, Georgia, and not too far from the coastal city of Savannah. "What do you suppose they're going to do at these camps?" Tommy asked. He'd just finished inspecting the tent to make sure it had the proper number of bunk beds and footlockers to house 24 people. Each tent also had 3 tables with 18 folding chairs, where the occupants could play cards, read a book, or otherwise entertain themselves. Tommy climbed back into the golf cart. His partner, Bill, answered, "I suspect they'll fill him up with prisoners from the war. You heard they captured over 10,000 prisoners up there in Washington, right?" "They captured 10,000 prisoners in D.C.?" Tommy asked skeptically. He stuffed some more chew in his lower lip. Bill just shook his head. "No, not D.C., Washington State. You know, up near Canada. It's on the West Coast. Geez, boy, didn't they teach you anything in school?" "Don't call me boy, old man. And yes, I know there is a state called Washington. I just got confused," Tommy replied. Most days Bill and Tommy got along pretty well, despite the fact that Bill was in his mid-50s and Tommy had just turned 19. They were both African American, and Bill pretty much called anyone younger than him boy, which agitated the hell out of Tommy, who took it as some sort of racial slur. "Let's go sign off on the next group of showers, Tommy," said Bill, trying to reframe the conversation. Tommy let out a deep breath, then asked, "You really think I should learn to become a plumber?" "I do," Bill responded. "Look, I don't mean to insult you when I say this, Tommy, but let's face it, you aren't the sharpest tool in the shed. I know you had to drop out of school to get a job and help support your mama and all, but being a plumber is good work. You don't need a college degree for it, and you can make really good money. You're good with your hands. Heck, a month ago you wouldn't have had a clue how to set up one of these shower trailers. Now you can practically do it yourself." Tommy nodded at the compliment. "I guess I am getting pretty good at this," he said, suddenly sitting up taller. "But still, going to trade school costs money, something I obviously don't have." Bill was silent for a moment as they pulled forward to the next set of trailers they had to inspect. When they hopped out of the golf cart, he put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "If you agree to work for my company for 3 years after you complete trade school, I'll pay for it, Tommy. As you can see, I have more work than I can handle. Besides, I told your mother I'd do my best to help you, because your father was a good friend of mine. But I need you to commit to working for me while you're in school, and for 3 years afterwards. Deal?" Tommy thought about that for all of 2 seconds before he stuck his hand out. "Deal. Now let me do the final inspection on this unit, and you check to make sure I did it right." Bill smiled at his new apprentice and nodded. For the next couple of hours, they finished signing off on all the shower units and the rest of the tents they'd been assigned to inspect. Once they finished their final checks of each tent and building, they'd let the camp manager know it was ready for whatever was coming next. As they drove down the rows of tents, they saw another work crew was finishing up a guard tower. The tall structures were being placed along the outer perimeter fence, every 200 meters apart. The outer barriers themselves were 12 feet tall, with a coiled string of razor-sharp concertina wire on the top. Another crew set up light poles every 20 meters, facing inward, illuminating the camp. By the time the sun set on the last day of January, Bill and Tommy certified the camp as complete and ready for operations. In the coming weeks, the camp population would swell to more than 8,000 people as the government filled it up with prisoners of war. Metcalf, Mississippi, DHS Detention Camp 14. George Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked into what would become the camp's administrative office building. He saw the commander of the 34th Military Police Company and walked over to him. "Afternoon, Captain Quinn," he said jovially. He poured himself a glass of sweet tea and took a seat in the chair next to the man's desk. Smiling at George, Quinn replied, "Afternoon, sir. I assume you've completed your inspection?" George nodded as he finished draining the contents of his glass. "I sure did. I must say, Captain, I'm impressed. Your soldiers are quick and professional. This place looks great." "Well, our unit helped to run a detention camp in Afghanistan, so we have a lot of vets with experience in getting these things going. That said, it didn't hurt having a few hundred KBR contractors and a few hundred FEMA tents as well." George tilted his head to the side. "So how many contractors do you think you'll need to help manage the camp?" he asked. "Do you mean guards or just workers to keep the camp functional?" asked Quinn, leaning forward. "Both, I suppose. We've got 3 more of these camps going up right now, so I'm trying to get a handle on the numbers." Captain Quinn nodded. "Well, I think you'll need roughly 80 contractors to maintain the facilities, and we'll probably keep a guard force of roughly 600. I plan on having the guards working either 8 or 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, depending upon how many people we have to keep an eye on." He paused for a moment. "Roughly how many people are these camps going to hold, and for how long?" George shrugged his shoulders. "That's the million-dollar question, Captain. I know our capacity for each camp is roughly 5,000 people. As for how long, I can't be sure. I'd guess until this stupid conflict is done with. Could be a few weeks, could be a few months. All I know is when the next big offensive starts, they expect to capture a lot of prisoners." Leaning in closer, Quinn spoke in a hushed tone. "You have any insight into how the war is going at all? Are we winning, or is the country really going to split apart?" George looked around the room to make sure no one else was listening. "From what I've been told, the war in the north is going well, or at least as good as can be expected. The big concern right now is what's happening in Mexico and out west. I heard a rumor California and Oregon have been building up a large militia force. They've also started rounding up conservatives and anyone that's giving them problems and putting them in re-education camps." Captain Quinn snickered. "Isn't that what we're doing here?" George shook his head. "Not at all, Captain. This is going to be a POW camp. They're setting up a few other camps just like this for Americans who've chosen to take up arms against the government. If people are caught doing that, then they're getting sent to one of these camps until they can be tried in a court of law. There's a big difference between holding people until they can be prosecuted for a crime and outright rounding people up because you disagree with their politics." The two of them talked for a bit more as they worked out the details of how many guards and other workers they'd need to make the camps in the area run. George Thomas and Captain Quinn might not have been happy with it, but for better or worse, they found themselves managing some 6 detention camps in Mississippi. They'd do their best to make them run as safely and efficiently as possible. Camp Pendleton. Brigadier General Schell of Regimental Command Team 1 looked at his commanders briefly before he turned to point at a spot in the map of Southern California.
"Marines, as most of you know, California and a handful of other states are currently operating in a state of open revolt against our federal government. Thus far, we've been told to stay clear of the political crap going on there. However, with our forces having to withdraw from Japan, the Navy needs us to secure the ports of Long Beach and L.A. There's a sizable Japanese-American convoy of some 60-odd freighters, cargo ships, and roll-on, roll-off ships heading to the ports as we speak. Right now, the city government and the local port authorities have denied the federal government and us the use of the facilities. Therefore, We're going to go seize them. Now, I know many of you have some concerns about this, but it has to happen. We need to offload that equipment from Japan and get ready to deal with this Chinese force to our south. RCT-1 has been tasked with this mission, and we're going to achieve it. He motioned to a man near him. I'm now going to hand things over to the G2 for the latest intelligence summary of what we're facing. A major walked up to the front of the room and changed the PowerPoint slide to his portion of the brief. Once he was ready, he returned his gaze to the battalion and company commanders in front of him. Near the hills of San Clemente, the California National Guard's 1st Battalion, 160th Infantry Regiment, has set up a series of fortified positions along Interstate 5. Their goal is to keep us bottled up down here in San Diego County. To the north, in Temecula, along Interstate 15, 1st Squadron, 18th Cavalry Regiment, has set up a blocking force to keep us from gaining entry into the valley. The California Civil Defense Force has also moved a substantial number of militia units to the area. We are uncertain of their level of training, equipment, or numbers, but we're estimating their numbers to be somewhere around 2,000 or 3,000. They make up the bulk of the force opposing us. Under normal circumstances, we'd land our force behind them and bypass them altogether. However, we need to also secure a route for our equipment that'll be arriving in the ports back to San Diego County. That means we're going to have to clear them out. General Shell heard a few of the Marines grumble and saw some of them shaking their heads. He stood back up to interject. Listen, I know none of you guys like the idea of having to shoot fellow Americans, especially our Army brothers. But let's not forget something here. These guys made their choice. They opted to join the renegade government and fight against our country. We can't allow that to happen. We're going to give these guys one chance. They will either surrender peacefully or get crushed by the United States Marine Corps. The general paused for a second before he added, I want you to start preparing yourselves and your men for this. We push off to start this show in 12 hours, so we have time to get everything ready and also get a bit of rest. God only knows how long this operation will take, so let's be as prepared as we can for whatever may come next.
Interstate 5, near San Clemente. It was still dark, 0500 hours, as Staff Sergeant Max LAV-25 followed behind 4 M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks down Interstate 5 toward San Clemente. There was a lot of consternation among the men of Regimental Combat Team 1 as they inched closer and closer to a possible conflict with their Army brothers. Sergeant Mack had his own reservations. Given these were Army National Guard units, still many of them had served with plenty of regular Army and National Guard soldiers in the Iraq and Afghan wars. While they weren't Marines, they were still blood brothers from a war they'd collectively fought together. The thought of having to kill them wasn't sitting well. Mack could tell that the younger Marines who hadn't seen combat in Iraq or Afghanistan didn't seem to be questioning the orders, but the more seasoned Marines were coming to grips with the horrible situation. Captain Turpin picked up on the foul mood. You look like you're chewing on a lemon, Staff Sergeant, he commented. Mack shrugged. A big part of me hopes we don't have to actually fight these guys. I'm hoping they'll just surrender or go away. I know how you feel, Sergeant. When I was enlisted, this National Guard unit that's standing in our way in San Clemente was operating in our AO in Iraq during my first deployment. We didn't have a lot of interaction with them, but what I do remember was that despite them being a National Guard unit, they sure knew how to take the fight to the enemy. Captain Turpin paused for a moment. I hope the veterans of those deployments don't view us in the same manner. We're not the enemy, and neither are they. We're all just caught up in this three-dimensional chess game some higher-ups are playing. We're just pawns being moved around on a board none of us understand or can see. I pray none of our guys have to get killed because people can't come to their senses." Before either of them could say anything further, the Sinkgar's radio crackled to life with the voice of the tank commander, leading the force ahead of them. "Loki 6, Hammer 6, how copy?" Captain Turpin grabbed the radio and depressed the talk button, waiting for a second for the receiver to beep, signaling that the device had synced. "Hammer 6, Loki 6, send it. I got a roadblock roughly 2,000 meters to my front. Thermals are showing multiple enemy positions dug in along the spur leading up to the ridge. How do you want us to proceed?" Turpin swore under his breath. Then, speaking back into the receiver, he said, "What is the roadblock made of? Do you see any other armored vehicles?" "The roadblock consists of at least 2 18-wheel semi-trucks and trailers blocking both directions of traffic. As to enemy armor, yeah. There's an Abrams battle tank that just poked its head around a position. He's aimed right at us, but hasn't fired yet. Do we try and talk to them?" Before Turpin could reply, Mac asked, "What if we approach them under a white flag? Let's try and talk to them before we start shooting. If they've got Abrams battle tanks just like ours, chances are they'll have artillery and other nasty surprises waiting for us. This could get really bloody really quickly." Nodding at the suggestion, Captain Turpin responded, "Go find me a white flag then, Mac." Talking into the receiver, Turpin ordered, "Hammer 6, stand by. Don't do anything that may make them want to attack you. As a matter of fact, back up a few hundred meters. I'm coming forward under a white flag to try and talk some sense into these guys." "Loki 6, this is War Machine Actual. Stand down your approach to the enemy lines. I'm en route to your position. We'll approach them together." Sergeant Mack lifted an eyebrow, as did Captain Turpin. The general had overheard their conversation. 10 tense minutes went by, as more National Guard soldiers filtered into some fighting positions along the hill crests that dotted this area of Interstate 5. They could hear the sound of tracks moving along. More tanks were nearby. Brigadier General Schell walked up to Turpin. "This your idea, Captain?" he asked with a wry smile. Captain Turpin shook his head. "He was my staff sergeant here." Turpin turned to face Mac. "Good idea, Sergeant. So, since this was your bright idea, I want you to come with us. Stay frosty, and be ready to drop these guys if we have to. You got me?" Smiling, Mac nodded his head. "Yes, sir. Locked and ready to rock." The four of them headed out down the road, past the 4 Marine battle tanks and a couple of LAVs that had also taken up defensive positions. When they got to the front of the vehicles, Lance Corporal Pyro, who had been designated as the man to carry the flag, waved it a couple of times high above their heads. He did that for maybe 60 seconds before he led the way, walking toward the enemy roadblock. It took them a few minutes to walk the 2,000 meters to the barricade. When they got a few hundred meters away, a voice called out, "That's far enough. We're under a flag of truce. I'd like to talk to whoever is in charge," General Schell bellowed. "Stand by, we'll get the colonel." As the 4 Marines stood there, they observed that a lot of people had weapons trained on them. Most were wearing the Army's ACU uniform, but there were also a lot of folks who appeared to be wearing a hodgepodge of different camouflage uniforms. Those must be civilian militia units joining their ranks, thought Staff Sergeant Mack. 5 minutes went by, and then an Army colonel walked forward with several additional soldiers. 2 of the people joining him appeared to be wearing civilian camouflage. The 2 groups of warriors sized each other up. Eventually, one of the men across from them stepped forward, extending his hand. "I'm Colonel Griffin, the commander of the California Army National Guard 79th Infantry Brigade Combat Team." One of the men in civilian camouflage stepped forward. He didn't extend his hand, but he puffed out his chest a bit as if to signal his own importance. "And I'm Brigadier General Ryan, of the California Civil Defense Force," he said. "I'm Brigadier General Shell, commander of Marine Regimental Combat Team 1. This is Captain Turpin, one of my company COs. I was hoping us commanders could talk for a few minutes and see if we could defuse this situation before a lot of people end up getting killed." Colonel Griffin nodded at the comment and smiled. He motioned for them to take a walk over to the center divider of the highway. General Ryan was about to join them when Griffin held a hand up. "Sir, I think it might be best if us military types talked first." Undeterred, Ryan insisted on being a part of the conversation. When the three of them stood next to the center divider, the two military men sat on the dividers while Ryan opted to stand. Looking at General Shell, Griffin said, "I suppose you're here because you want to pass through our lines on your way to the ports," he commented casually. Shell nodded. "That's right. I was hoping we could work something out, so none of us have to kill each other over it." "You guys should have thought about that before you sided with that illegitimate dictator in Washington," Ryan shot back, flashing him a look of scorn. Undeterred by the man's outburst, Shell continued his conversation with the Army colonel. "We have a large convoy coming in from Japan. It's going to dock at the ports of LA and Long Beach to begin offloading our equipment being brought back home from Asia. I'd like my boys to be able to pass through without a problem, secure the port, and escort their contents back to San Diego County." "Those ports are off limits to the federal government. You'll have to find another port to use, General," the CDF officer said gruffly. Turning to look at the wannabe general, Shell crossed his arms. He'd had enough. "Listen up, you civilian puke. Just because they pinned a star on your shoulder doesn't mean you know crap about the military or our capabilities. I have an entire RCT ready to punch its way into LA. We have 32,000 Marines arriving from Japan in 48 hours. I have enough firepower to destroy your little world here and kill every last one of you." General Shell took a deep breath. In a calmer voice, he said, "I'm trying to talk to the man who's in charge to see if we can prevent our two groups from coming to blows. If fighting starts, I have to afford his men the same rights they'd have to afford my men under the Geneva Conventions. However, if we capture you or your men, our orders are to either hang you on sight or execute you by firing squad. You all have been declared unlawful enemy combatants and have no rights. So why don't you shut the hell up and let the professionals talk?" Ryan was aghast. He huffed and puffed a bit and then walked away, cursing under his breath. "That guy's been a freaking pain in my ass since the first day he arrived," Colonel Griffin said with a grin on his face. "Hey, maybe you could help me out with something, General. What the hell is going on down in Mexico? We keep hearing there's some grand Chinese army that's going to help us liberate the state of California." General Shell snorted at the question. "You heard right. There are two large army groups. One's down near Texas, and the other is south of San Diego County. Right now, I'm stuck having to deal with you guys to my north and the Chinese to my south. I'd really like it if your force could help us keep these Chinese bastards out of our country instead of viewing them as liberators. You know what'll happen if they get a foothold here? We'll never get rid of them." Colonel Griffin nodded. "I don't doubt you, General. Hell, I wish I could deploy my brigade down to the border to help you guys right now. But I've got orders from the governor. I'm supposed to keep your Marines bottled up in San Diego County and away from the rest of the state." "Colonel, you know if I want to punch through your force, I can do it. I may lose some Marines in the process, but I've got gunships, FA-18s, and other support I can call on to take you guys out. I'd rather not, because at the end of the day, I need your tanks, striker vehicles, and soldiers to help me defeat this Chinese army to my south.
But if you're going to be a problem, Colonel, then I'm going to have to deal with you guys as quickly as I can. Is there any way we can avoid having to fight each other? Do you need me to take these militia guys out for you?" Now it was Griffin's turn to sigh and think about the problem. Shell imagined he was weighing his oath to the Constitution and his allegiance to California. Suddenly, he seemed to have an idea. "What if we did this, General? What if you were to pull your force back and then appear like you were going to circumvent us here and make a run for Interstate 15 instead? I could convince Ryan that he needs to hold his boys in place here while I shift my force around to meet you guys. This will leave you facing only the CDF. You can solve my problem of having to deal with Ryan and his men, and then our two forces will completely avoid each other altogether. If I'm going to make a case to my troopers that we should switch sides again, and this time work with you to defeat the Chinese, I'm going to need more than 5 minutes, and I'm certainly going to need those CDF bastards dealt with. I'm pretty sure when my guys see your Marines slaughter them, they'll have second thoughts about wanting to fight you." Smiling, General Shell held his hand out for him to shake it. "Deal. I'll pull my guys back. But come hell or high water, tomorrow around this same time, my guys are going to come through this area like a freight train. We won't stop, and we won't be taking prisoners. Understood? Just make sure it's those CDF guys left here, and I'll take care of them for you. Once the rest of 3MEF arrives in port, you'll have an easier time of making the case to switch sides. We're going to have 2 full Marine divisions down here. You guys wouldn't stand a chance if you chose to fight. That said, we sure could use your help dealing with these Chinese soldiers that are gearing up to invade us." Almost breathing a sigh of relief, Colonel Griffin took his hand. "Deal. Just don't leave any of these CDF guys alive. You might even want to drop some heliborne troops behind them to make sure they don't fade away. These militia guys aren't real soldiers. They're radical leftists that view this conflict as a way to settle scores and fashion California into the socialist, leftist model they want. I'll be glad when you're done with them." The 2 military leaders parted ways, and within 30 minutes, General Shell had his entire RCT turned around to head back to Pendleton. He made sure to send a force over to Interstate 15 to be part of the ruse they'd agreed on. When his scout units launched a few drones over the area, they confirmed that the Army colonel was, in fact, moving his units to I-15, just as they'd agreed. Come tomorrow morning, they'd find out if they had just been suckered into a bigger trap, or if they might have found a new ally. "Stand by for contact. We're 5 minutes out from the roadblock," the vehicle commander said to Captain Turpin. Unlike yesterday, their convoy of vehicles was racing down Interstate 5 on their way to deal with the California Civil Defense Force. Now that their scout drones had confirmed there were no tanks, Strykers, or Bradley fighting vehicles at the roadblock or anywhere nearby, the 4 tanks in the lead opted to barrel down the highway and punch a hole right through the barricade and clear a path for the infantry. Depressing the talk button on his radio, Captain Turpin called out, "All Loki elements, when the tanks clear us a path through the barricade, I want you guys to push through the newly created hole and head for objective Foxtrot. Platoon leaders, you need to secure the housing development overlooking the interstate before you expand further up the ridgeline. If you run into any serious challenges, we have MAG 39 on standby, ready to bring the pain. Let's do this, Marines. Loki 6 out." With his little pep talk done, Turpin turned to Staff Sergeant Mack. "Remember, Sergeant, no prisoners, unless they are wearing an Army ACU. Copy?" Mack just nodded, and so did the 3 other Marines of his squad in the vehicle. The rest of his team was in the following 2 LAVs. Boom! Boom! The lead tanks fired 2 rounds,
blowing the semi-trucks apart. They then charged forward toward the tractor-trailers. While this was happening, the militia soldiers all along the spur, ridge, and other fixed positions around the choke point along the interstate opened fire on the armored column. Seconds after the fireworks started, the gunner in the LAV Mac and Turpin were riding in fired his 25mm at some unseen target. As they got closer to the barricade, they heard bullets pinging and bouncing off their armored shell. They were taking fire from the militia. "We're through the barricade, Captain. We're headed to your objective now," the vehicle commander announced as they turned off the interstate. Once they were through the barricade, they found that the volume of enemy fire being directed at their vehicle dwindled immensely. The sounds of war, however, only increased. They heard more tank rounds, along with a new sound: mortars. "We're here," shouted out the vehicle commander. The roar of gunfire continued to build outside their armored shell. "Okay, everyone out," Mac ordered. "Let's get formed up and do this thing." Crump, crump, crump. Mortar rounds landed where the barricade had just been. Most of the rounds missed the Marine vehicles, but every now and then a lucky one would score a direct hit on one of the LAVs, AAVs, or troop trucks, killing a lot of good Marines. Ping, zip, zap. Bullets smacked against the LAV that Mac and his guys had just exited. Turning to see where the enemy fire was coming from, Sergeant Mac spotted a cluster of houses at the top of the spur. It looked like they had set up some fighting positions at the top. The place gave the militiamen an excellent position to rain fire down on them. It had to be taken out. "First squad, form up on me," shouted Staff Sergeant Mac. He ran past the LAV to a small embankment at the base of the spur. He needed to get his squad under some sort of cover so they could formulate a plan on how to take out that enemy position. Looking to his right and left, Mac saw the 13 Marines of his squad were ready for his next set of orders. Several of his men were returning fire at the attackers. The enemy was probably about 500 meters above them, so it was almost pointless for them to fire back with their rifles, although it did make them feel like they were doing something. "What do you want us to do, Sarge?" asked one of his fire team leaders. "Where's my RTO?" Mac asked. "Here, Staff Sergeant." The Marine who was carrying their Sync GARS radio stepped forward and took a knee next to him. The young men looked at him with the expression of a nervous puppy in a thunderstorm. Bullets randomly hit all around them. At this distance, the enemy fire wasn't particularly accurate, but it did keep them on their toes. "Get Mag 38 on the horn," Mac ordered. "I want to see if we can get one of those gunships to take those guys out, or at least give us some covering fire while we bound up this spur." The young Marine pulled out his notepad, which had the frequencies and call signs on it for the units in their company, battalion, and support elements. Once he found what he was looking for, he contacted one of the gunships and handed the radio hand receiver over to Sergeant Mac. Mac glanced at the young man's notepad and saw the call sign before he depressed the talk button. "Thunderbolt 2, this is Loki 1-6. I've got an enemy position that needs some love. How copy?" "Loki 1-6, that's a good copy. Send the grid." "Enemy bunker and multiple fighting positions on top of the spur. Grid SC 7854-8543. How copy?" There was a short pause, and then the gunship replied, "Good copy. Enemy bunker and fighting positions on top of the spur. We'll make a quick pass of the area to confirm the targets, and then we'll engage. Can you pop some smoke at your position so we can know where you are in relationship to the target?" asked the pilot. Mac was more than happy to oblige the request. He wanted to make sure they didn't accidentally hit the Marines they were supposed to support. He turned to one of his squad leaders. "Pop a smoke grenade for the gunships," Mac ordered. A second later, a purple smoke grenade started puffing away a handful of feet in front of their positions. The wind caused the trail to drift upwards into the early morning light. Thunderbolt 2. What color smoke do you see? Loki 1-6. I see purple smoke. That's us. Good copy. Stand by. We're making our run now. Sergeant Mack looked off toward the ocean. He heard the rhythmic thumping sound of helicopter blades. Eventually, he spotted a pair of Super Cobra attack helicopters swoop in. They made a quick pass over the targeted area, attracting a ton of enemy gunfire. Then both of the Cobras spat out flares and banked hard to one side, attempting to gain altitude at the same time. Max saw two small objects fly up from the ground and chase after them. The helicopters split up. One dove for the deck, while the other tried to lose the missile in a nearby canyon. Unfortunately, the Cobra that flew toward the canyon soared into another small pocket of militiamen, who summarily fired off a second stinger at them. A second later, the missile hit the helicopter, blowing it apart. The second Cobra managed to escape. It circled back around to where it had been attacked and fired off 2 missiles before it headed back out to sea. Loki 1-6, we're going to see if we can't get some fast movers to plaster that enemy position for you, the Cobra pilot announced. It looks like these guys have some stingers. Helicopters don't like stingers. That's good copy. We'll stand by for the fast movers. While Mac's squad continued to hold their position, the rest of the platoon fanned out nearby as they waited for the Hornets to plaster the top of the spur. Then they'd bound up the hill and secure their first objective. Looking again out toward the sea, Mac saw 2 objects flying fast toward them. The FA-18s flew right over the enemy positions, releasing several small objects from beneath their wings. With their special delivery made, the Super Hornets released a series of flares as they went almost vertical, lighting up their afterburners in the process. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. Nothing more than noisy specks in the sky. Sergeant Mack returned his gaze to the top of the spur just in time to see the entire area explode in a series of massive fireballs. That's it. All Loki elements, charge! Came the call over the radio from their captain. You heard the captain. Charge! Mac yelled. He lifted his body up over the embankment where they'd been hiding and raced up the hill, willing his muscles and mind to overcome the pain and burning he felt as his body, laden down with over 100 pounds of body armor and gear, tried to run for all it's worth up the steep incline. As he rushed forward, Mac saw the fireballs starting to dissipate. Crap, he thought. Whatever defenders had survived the attack would resume shooting at him and his men soon. We needed to get to the top of this position swiftly. As he continued to struggle up the hill, his quad muscles burned intensely. His chest started to hurt as his lungs fought to keep his muscles oxygenated. Several Marines charged right past him, which only spurred him to push harder. Zip, zap, zip, zap. As they got closer to the top of the hill, bullets flew back down at them. They were now less than 100 yards from the top. Kneeling beside some rocks, Mac looked up and saw a handful of defenders had somehow survived the barbecue the Hornets had delivered. They were geared up for revenge. Lifting his rifle to his shoulder, Mac aimed at one determined militiaman who kept firing at his Marines. He heard some of his guys calling out for a corpsman, so he knew some of them were getting hit. It infuriated him that his Marines were dying because of these militia groups. Sighting in on the guy who was firing what appeared to be an AR-15, Mac fired a single shot. His shot hit the guy and knocked him down. Sergeant Mac smiled. At least I took one of them down. Then, to his dismay, the militia soldier got back up and started shooting back at them again. Shaking his head in disbelief, Mac realized the man must have been wearing some sort of body armor. He took aim at the man again, but moved his selector from semi to burst. Once Mac got a good sight picture on the man, he squeezed the trigger. He felt the 3-round burst leave the barrel. This time, the militiaman didn't get back up. Seeing the immediate threat gone, Sergeant Mack continued to charge up the hill with the rest of his squad and platoon. When he got within 20 meters of the top, he saw half a dozen of his Marines charge right over it. They were firing away at something just outside of his vision. "Grenade!" Crump. "Take that machine gun out! Covering fire!" Crump, crump. "Corpsman! Oh, God, I'm hit! Corpsman!" When he reached the top of the hill, Mac was greeted by a dystopian wasteland. More than a dozen houses were burning, and several dozen cars, pickup trucks, and SUVs were nothing more than charred wrecks. Bodies were strewn everywhere. Pushing past the initial shocked reaction, Sergeant Mack spotted some militiamen shooting at his Marines from deeper into the housing development. Small clusters of Marines were advancing cautiously from one covered position to another, returning fire. Mack was horrified as he realized that this was a civilian community that was being destroyed. This isn't what I signed up for. He had no desire to devastate an American neighborhood at all, but he also didn't see any way around it. Just then, Mac heard the familiar engine sounds of an LAV and looked down toward the incoming noise. He watched as several of the vehicles crashed through the front gate of the housing community, then made their way up to the top of the hill where the rest of his platoon was. A new sound that didn't fit in with all of the clamor of war reached Mac's ears. "Please help!" a woman screamed. "Someone, please help us! Don't shoot! My daughter's been shot!" Mac saw a woman carrying a small child in her arms, running towards him, tears in her eyes. He rushed forward and shouted, "Corpsman!" A couple of other Marines joined him as they raced to the woman and her daughter. Her little girl was probably only 4 or 5 years old, and she cried uncontrollably, barely able to catch her breath. Blood streamed down from her left leg. Mac found an apparent gunshot wound. Her face looked pale and clammy, probably from loss of blood and shock. "We need to apply pressure to the wound," Mac instructed. Just then, their squad's corpsman arrived and took charge of the little girl's care. Mac and the other Marines who'd come to assist took a knee, creating a small circle to protect them. "Ma'am, I need you to put the girl down so I can start working on her." The Navy corpsman pulled his aid bag out of his back and pulled out a pair of scissors. "I just need to cut the pants a bit so I can see your leg better, okay?" he explained to the little girl. She sobbed, but nodded. As the corpsman continued working on her, several bullets ricocheted off the asphalt near them. The little girl screamed and the mother started crying hysterically. "Take those bastards out!" yelled Mac to a couple of Marines nearby. One of the Marines leveled his M240 Golf at the house where the shots had just come from and opened fire. The mother and daughter screamed some more as they heard the roar of the machine gun open up next to them. Hot, spent shell casings landed on the ground around the mother's feet. Mac and another Marine ran toward the house while the machine gunner provided them with some covering fire. When the two of them got to the wall of the house, the machine gunner stopped shooting, but stayed ready to provide covering fire for their medic. Now that Mac had made it to the wall of the house, he motioned for his comrade to get one of his grenades ready. The two of them moved toward 2 of the windows facing the street, where their medic was working on the little girl. Holding a hand up with his fingers out, Mac silently counted down as he pulled one finger down after another. He then pulled the pin on his grenade, just as his comrade did. Then the two of them held the grenades for 2 seconds, counting down the fuse just a bit before they lobbed them inside. Boom! Boom! They heard a couple of curse words and at least 2 people moaning in pain. A third voice said something they couldn't understand. Knowing the defenders were stunned and hurt, Mac motioned for his squad mate to breach the door with him. In one swift movement, Mac kicked the door hard right at the handle, breaking it open. The door swung inward, and he rushed in with his rifle at the ready. He swept to the room to the left, while his partner swept to the right. Mac saw one defender lying on the ground, attempting to stop the bleeding from a wound in his leg. Without thinking, Mac fired several rounds into the man's chest, killing him. "Moving right!" shouted the Marine as he moved to clear the next room. Mac heard a couple of shots before the man called, "Room cleared!" As he advanced down the hallway, Mac heard some voices coming from one of the other rooms, so he paused. He grabbed another one of his grenades from his IBA and pulled the pin. He let it cook down for 2 seconds before he tossed it into the room where he'd heard the voices. "Grenade, get down!" Mac heard. Boom! Several pieces of shrapnel blew through the wall, and Mac winced as he felt something bite at his left arm. Brushing the pain off, Mac whirled around the corner and saw the 2 defenders. Both of them were dead, ripped apart by the grenade. "You all right, Staff Sergeant?" his partner asked. "Yeah, I think I got clipped by a piece of my own grenade. I'm going to clear the next room." It took them a couple of minutes to finish clearing the house. With no more defenders hiding inside, they moved back outside and headed back to where the medic had been working on the little girl. They didn't find them there. "Where's Doc?" Sergeant Mac asked. Lance Corporal Pyro explained. "He took the girl and her mother over to the casualty collection point over there." Pyro pointed to a section further down the road where it looked like 2 of their corpsmen were treating several wounded Marines along with a few wounded civilians. Looking around, Mac saw most of his squad was engaging another house further up the block. Seeing that the little girl had been taken care of and this house had been cleared of threats, he had the 2 other Marines follow him and catch back up with their squad. Bang, bang, bang! Sergeant Mac breathed a sigh of relief. One of the LAVs had finally made it to their location and began using its 25mm cannon to tear into another house that had been turned into a bunker. Soon a 2nd, 3rd, and 4th LAV had arrived in the neighborhood. Behind them was a JLTV that had a bright red cross painted on the sides. As he continued forward, Mac glanced back to see the tactical ambulance make its way over to the casualty collection point where they'd be able to load up the wounded. The fight in this area went on for another hour as the last holdouts were found and killed. By mid-morning, the battle for San Clemente was over. A battalion of Marines continued to stay in the area to keep the highway open and clear it of any remnants still wanting to fight, while the rest of the RCT continued to the ports. The following day, Colonel Griffin drove up to the Old Dubliner in Long Beach. It was a nice little Irish pub near the port facility that the Marines had taken over. Attached to the antenna of his JLTV was a white pillowcase they were using for a flag. He wanted to make sure his vehicle didn't get lit up by some trigger-happy jarheads on his way to meet with their general. Pulling up to the Irish pub, Griffin spotted a couple of LAVs and Amtraks, along with probably 30 or so Marines that he assumed were either pulling guard duty or eating at the pub. It was odd seeing so many military vehicles inside such a large city. It reminded him of Iraq or Afghanistan, not America. There wasn't any official polling out to gauge the mood of the people of Long Beach, but Colonel Griffin's impression was that many of the residents were glad to be rid of their CDF overlords. Still, others were defiantly concerned that fighting could break out at any moment, especially if the California Army National Guard opted to fight. Last night, a few gangbangers had thought they could take advantage of the situation and tried to ambush a squad of Marines a few blocks away. Needless to say, that didn't go very well for them. Since that incident occurred, the Marines had pretty much been shooting anyone on sight that looked like a gang member or who made an overt threat toward them. It might have been overkill, but they were tired of being shot at, and with much of the police force giving the Marines a wide berth, there weren't a lot of options left to dealing with threats like that. As Colonel Griffin's vehicle pulled up to the restaurant, a young Marine guided them to a spot where they wanted them to park. For the most part, they kept their rifles at the low ready, which made him feel a bit better about the meeting. When he exited his JLTV, a couple of Marines walked toward him and saluted. Griffin returned the salute. "I'm supposed to meet with General Shell," he announced. The Marines nodded and gestured for him to follow them inside, When Griffin entered the pub, he spotted the general sitting at a long table with a handful of other officers and NCOs. He also saw a number of maps spread out on the table. General Shell stood when he saw him, and the two shook hands. Shell took a moment to introduce some of the officers at the table, and then they sat down. They placed an order for some fish and chips before the two military commanders got down to business.
Well, Colonel, you held up your end of the bargain. My men stayed clear of your guys, and we took out that militia force for you. I can't be certain that we killed that wannabe general, but we certainly took his force out. Are your men ready to cross back over to our side and come back into the fold?
Griffin had talked with his officers and senior NCOs the night before. The consensus was that they should take the Marines up on their offer. His men told him they felt caught between a rock and a hard place. While they owed their loyalty to the state and their community, they also knew in their hearts and heads that breaking away from the federal government and joining this UN peacekeeping force was tearing the country and the state apart. Everything about it just felt wrong. His officers and NCOs felt like they'd just been given a golden opportunity to receive mercy for a crime they didn't want to commit, and they were determined to take the pardon. General Shell, my men and I have come to the conclusion that while we have a responsibility to our governor, we also have a responsibility to the Constitution. I can't guarantee that all my men will switch back over, but what I can tell you is that all my battalion and company-grade officers and commanders, along with my senior NCOs, will. We'll do our best to make sure our men comply with our orders as well. The Marines at the table were visibly relieved by the news. Colonel Griffin related to those sentiments. This whole business of fighting your countrymen was sickening.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.